When people picture the Mongols, they imagine unstoppable warriors on horseback, swift, deadly everywhere at once. And to be fair, it wasn't far from the truth. Between 1162 and 1227, during the reign of Genghis Khan, the Mongols tore across Asia and into Europe, wiping out nearly 20 kingdoms and states. 20 whole governments, cities, even dynasties just erased. By all normal expectations, a force made up of scattered nomadic horsemen shouldn't have had the backbone to sustain something this massive. And yet, they did. At its height, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in history. Not even Rome, the so-called eternal giant, could match it. No wonder their enemies whispered that the Mongols could march forever. But yet most people today don't realize how such a thing was even possible. Welcome to Heroic History, your daily channel for incredible stories of ancient warfare. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button so we can keep uncovering the epic strategies that shaped our world. So the question is, how? How did they actually pull it off? How did men cover 30, 40, even 60 miles in a single day and then wake up and do it again and again without breaking? And maybe the biggest question of all, how did they solve one of the hardest problems in military history, conquering fast and staying present across an empire the size of a continent? Let's find out. Let's peel it back layer by layer. The first key lies in their ability to keep marching day after day without ever losing speed, thanks to a system that cut out outside dependence and transformed scattered nomadic clans into a highly modular war machine. The secret weapon was a simple but brilliant structure, the decimal system. The army was broken down into clear units, an arban of 10 men grouped into a jagun of 100, then into a mingan of 1,000, and finally the mighty tumen, 10,000 strong. Most of their force was made up of light cavalry, fast, lightly armored horse archers who could ride circles around enemies, peppering them with arrows, retreating and striking again. But they also kept a significant number of heavily armored cavalry, almost like medieval tanks on horseback for the moments when a battle needed a finishing blow. This combination meant that while the light cavalry kept up the relentless pace, the heavy cavalry could deliver decisive shock attacks when the time was right. The balance was critical. Too many heavy cavalry and the army would slow down. Too many light cavalry and they might struggle in close combat. The Mongols found the sweet spot. A Mongol force of maybe 20,000 riders breaking down into units, all moving in sync. The light cavalry rides ahead, loosing arrows in waves, forcing the enemy to break formation. The enemy panics, thinking the Mongols are retreating. But suddenly the heavy cavalry slams into them at full speed. The battle ends swiftly, supplies are spared, horses are fresh for the next march. And it wasn't just about command. It was logistics too. Each two men was like a self-contained military base. It had its own command, its own way of sourcing supplies, and the ability to function without waiting for directions or deliveries from some far-off capital. That meant Mongol armies could fight on multiple fronts at the same time, like during the Great Western campaigns in Europe, and never choke on the problem that plagued most medieval armies: long, vulnerable supply chains. Instead of one giant army dragging wagons behind it, you had dozens of independent mobile fortresses on horseback, each able to find food and solve problems locally. That's why the idea of the forever march was possible. Of course, none of this would have worked without discipline, and Genghis Khan enforced it like no one else. His soldiers weren't just expected to follow orders in battle. One of the most underrated aspects of this discipline was preventative logistics, basically mandatory maintenance. Every warrior was required to keep his weapons, armor, and even tiny essentials like needles and thread in perfect working order. That might not seem like a big deal, but just think about how far that ripple effect goes. Most medieval armies slowed to a crawl because gear broke down, carts snapped, armor rusted, weapons dulled. Fixing those things meant bringing along blacksmiths, carpenters, and entire supply trains. The Mongols cut out that middleman by making every soldier his own repair crew. They eliminated one of the biggest bottlenecks of medieval warfare. It's what modern military planners would call preventative logistics, keeping everything combat ready so small breakdowns never turned into big problems. In other words, discipline itself became a supply system. From childhood, boys were trained to ride horses, shoot arrows, and endure long stretches without much food or rest. By the time they were soldiers, hardship was almost second nature. What really held it all together, though, was discipline. Absolute, no questions asked discipline. This wasn't an army that complained about sore feet or missing meals. They were trained to expect problems in supply lines, missing rations, delayed herds, bad weather, and keep marching anyway. In a way, they were mentally preloaded for exhaustion. Their commanders had built the expectation that no matter what, the army must be ready to march forever. And when the fighting did come, the Mongols reached for the weapon that made them feared across continents, their bows. It was a technological marvel of its time, made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew glued together. What made it special was its compact, curved shape. A short bow like this was perfect for horseback. Soldiers could fire in full gallop without the weapon getting in the way. Yet despite its small size, it had tremendous power. A Mongol bow could shoot an arrow well over 300 yards. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 3 football fields laid end to end. Now imagine hundreds or even thousands of riders, each firing rapidly from horseback, keeping their distance, but never letting the enemy rest. Unlike the early hand cannons and primitive firearms that were starting to pop up in the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mongol bow was faster, more accurate, and didn't misfire in the rain. Gunpowder weapons of that era were slow, heavy, and unreliable. Try lugging one of those across the steppe. The Mongols had the perfect match of speed and firepower, so their momentum in battle never broke. It was like they had designed a weapon, not just for killing, but for keeping their entire logistical machine moving smoothly. That's why, in many clashes, they could win decisively in hours, rather than dragging out a siege or battle for days. And shorter battles meant less strain on supplies, horses, and men. But there was still one more challenge: endurance. Moving 60 miles a day across open terrain isn't something you can just decide to do. It has to be trained into you. And that's where the Nerge, or Great Hunt, came in. Once a year, the Mongols staged this enormous hunt across the steppe. Looks like they're just out chasing. But in truth, it was a live fire exercise for the battlefield. Thousands of riders moved in coordinated sweeps, following strict orders, circling, tightening, and driving animals into traps. Anyone who disobeyed commands could be punished, sometimes even executed. The Great Hunt was less about the kill and more about endurance. Soldiers were pushed to ride long hours with little food, often in harsh conditions. It hardened them, not just physically, but mentally, conditioning them to keep marching, keep fighting, even when exhausted. No wonder modern armies still study it, trying to understand how a people could make toughness itself into a weapon. But grit alone didn't carry them across continents. There was another secret: their horses. Their horses were small compared to the tall, muscular war horses you'd see in Europe. But don't let size fool you. These steppe ponies were tough as nails. They could graze on scraggly grass, survive brutal winters, and bounce back from conditions that would kill a more delicate European breed. That meant Mongol armies could operate in regions where most other cavalry forces would have collapsed. This is where Mongol ingenuity stood out, the so-called 5-horse strategy. The idea is that each Mongol rider had a string of horses, often around 5, which he rotated throughout the day. Even though the exact number varied, the principle was what mattered. Instead of exhausting one animal with endless riding, a warrior could switch mounts, letting each horse rest and recover. This simple system gave the Mongols an enormous edge. They could maintain high speeds for days without burning out their horses. And remember, these horses didn't need sacks of oats hauled along in wagons. They ate as they moved, grazing directly on the land. That eliminated one of the heaviest burdens in medieval warfare: animal fodder. European armies often dragged along carts piled high with hay, which slowed everything down. The Mongols carried nothing. Their supply chain was literally the grass under their horses' hooves. That's why historians sometimes call it an anti-forage solution. Instead of lugging bulky supplies, the Mongols outsourced the job to the environment itself. Now let's talk numbers, because this is where the scale of their advantage comes into focus. On a regular march, Mongol cavalry could cover about 40 to 50 kilometers a day. That's already faster than most medieval armies. But when they needed to, they could shift into what we'd call a forced march, hitting speeds of 60 to 65 miles in a single day. That's 96 to 104 kilometers. To put that in perspective, a Roman legion on foot could manage 25 to 35 kilometers a day on well-built roads and maybe 40 to 50 on a really hard push. A medieval European feudal army often struggled to do even 20 kilometers, weighed down by carts, servants, and local foraging. The Mongols were doubling or even tripling that pace. And this isn't just theory, it's backed up by history. In 1221, Genghis Khan's forces marched from Bamiyan to Ghazna, covering 130 miles in just 2 days. That's the kind of speed modern armies with trucks and fuel would admire. Or take the winter of 1241. Mongol forces crossed the Carpathian Mountains at 60 miles a day in snow, at a time when most European forces could barely move at all. The effect of this speed went far beyond simple movement. It hit enemies on a psychological level. Think about it. Defenders might hear that the Mongols were weeks away, only to find them at the gates in a matter of days. That shock shattered morale. Cities surrendered before fights even began. Armies panicked, scrambling to prepare defenses that were already too late. This wasn't just about horses galloping fast. The Mongols cut the cord to fixed supply depots, freeing themselves from the slow, lumbering baggage trains that weighed other armies down. They were lighter, quicker, and nearly impossible to pin down. So how did they pull that off? By replacing bulk with density. Instead of dragging around wagon loads of grain or herds of livestock, they carried what was basically the medieval world's version of an energy bar: borts. Borts was dried beef or mutton sliced thin and air-cured on the open steppe. A kilogram of fresh meat shrank down to just 200 to 300 gras after drying. That's a chunk small enough to fit in your palm. Yet it packed the same nutrition. While fresh meat carried about 1,000 to 2,500 calories per kilo, borts concentrated that into 3,600 to 4,000 calories per kilo. In other words, for the same weight, you'd get almost 3 times the energy. Imagine a Mongol warrior heading into a 100-kilometer march. If he carried only fresh meat, the load would be heavy and his horse would tire faster. But swap that for a pouch of borts, and suddenly he's carrying far less weight for far more energy. Less burden on the rider means less strain on the horse, which in turn keeps the whole column moving at blistering speed. It's a feedback loop that kept the Mongols moving long after other armies would have stalled. And it wasn't just the calorie math that made borts brilliant. It was versatile. They could eat it dry like jerky, or grind it into powder, mix it with water, and have an instant soup. Even better, when soaked, it expands to about 2 1/2 times its dry size. So you're not just saving weight, you're saving space too. Every ounce counted when you were racing across the steppe. But food was only part of the story. The Mongols had mobile resources built right into their herds. They drank kumis, a fermented mare's milk that gave them both calories and hydration in a single drink. And here's one of the more shocking survival tactics. In dire situations, a soldier could nick a vein in his horse and drink the blood. Not enough to hurt the animal, but enough to keep himself alive. It sounds extreme, but think about it. Portable, renewable nutrition on the hoof, this harsh survival instinct drilled into them during the Great Hunt, the Nurge, meant that living off the land became not a logistical necessity, but a supplementary tactic. This combination, energy-dense food, portable protein, and renewable liquid nutrition, meant that the Mongol army didn't just move differently, they lived differently. Where other armies had to stop, forage, and wait for supply wagons to catch up, the Mongols kept riding. That's why their enemies weren't just beaten on the battlefield. They were outpaced, outlasted, and often psychologically crushed before the real fight even began. And if you thought food was the key to their endurance, wait until you see what their communication system did. Because the Mongols didn't just move fast, they could send orders faster than anyone else in the medieval world. You see, it wasn't enough for Mongol cavalry to move fast. They also had to stay coordinated while spread out across thousands of miles of open steppe. That's where the yam came in, the nervous system that made the whole war machine work. It turned tactical mobility into something far more dangerous, strategic coordination. The yam was essentially a vast relay network first expanded under Genghis Khan. Picture this. Along the major roads and routes of the empire, the Mongols built way stations called Ertu. Each station had shelter, food, and most importantly, fresh horses. A messenger would ride full speed to one of these stations, swap onto a new mount, and keep going without pause. This was the only fixed infrastructure the Mongols really bothered to maintain, but it made everything else possible. A messenger using the yam could cover 200 to 300 kilometers a day. That's about 120 to 190 miles. Compare that to the Mongol army itself, which at full forced march pace could manage roughly 96 to 104 kilometers in a day. In other words, news could travel almost 3 times faster than the soldiers themselves. Messages were literally outrunning armies. Think about what that means. A commander sitting hundreds of miles away could issue an order, and within a single day, that order could reach a Tumen, a 10,000-man unit already on the move. This prevented Mongol detachments from ever being truly isolated. They might be scattered across the map, but thanks to the yam, they moved as if guided by a single brain that could react to the enemy's movements faster than the enemy could react to theirs. This gap in speed, 100 kilometers per day for the army versus up to 300 kilometers for information, wasn't just a convenience, it was a decisive advantage. It meant the Mongols could shift strategy mid-campaign, launch surprise attacks with split forces, or redirect troops before their opponents even realized what was happening. It's the difference between trying to fight in the dark and fighting with night vision goggles. And the yam wasn't just about the battlefield. After Genghis expanded it, the system became the backbone of governance across the empire. New lands conquered by the Mongols weren't left in chaos. They were tied into a network where reports, tax records, and decrees could circulate almost in real time by medieval standards. This administrative use of the yam was so effective that even centuries later in Russia, parts of the system survived long after the Golden Horde itself had collapsed in the 15th century. To truly test the system, you've got to see it under pressure. When the storms came, the ground turned against them and the supply lines grew thin. That's where the true lessons lie. Take the Western campaign between 1237 and 1241. This was the invasion of Europe that put the Mongols face to face with rivers, mountains, and a brutal winter. The single best example of their logistical genius came in early 1241 when they crossed the Carpathian Mountains. Snow, ice, narrow passes that would normally slow an army to a crawl. Most medieval forces would have struggled to make 15 or maybe 20 miles in such conditions, if they could even move at all. But the Mongols, they were still pushing an astonishing 60 miles a day. That's about 96 kilometers daily in winter across mountains. It was possible only because they weren't dragging supply wagons or waiting on grain shipments. Instead, they carried dried meat called borts, lightweight, easy to pack and lasting for months, and they rotated their horses so no mount burned out. The result? They moved like a storm front, hitting faster and harder than anyone thought possible. You can almost imagine the shock of European defenders expecting weeks of warning, only to see Mongol banners appearing on the horizon in days. But here's where the story takes a turn. That same system, brilliant on the open steppe, didn't always translate well when the battlefield shifted into settled fortified lands. After 1260, when the Mongols went up against the Mamluk Sultanate in the Middle East, the cracks began to show. The Levant wasn't wide grassland. It was a patchwork of fortified towns, dry stretches with scarce water, and farmland already controlled or defended by a determined enemy. In that environment, speed and endurance couldn't do all the work. The Mongols depended on their horses grazing as they went, and on their soldiers surviving on the bare minimum. But in the Levant, pasture was limited, wells could be poisoned or defended, and sieges dragged out longer than their lean supply model could handle. That's why historians say the Mongol logistical system was optimized for expansion, not occupation. It was perfect for the lightning strike, the sweeping campaign across open land, but it wasn't designed to dig in, grind through long supply lines, or sustain itself in environments where grass and water, the lifeblood of horse-based warfare, were scarce. When we step back and look at the Mongol war machine as a whole, it becomes clear this wasn't just about riding fast or shooting arrows. Well, the Mongols had essentially built the first blueprint for what modern militaries today would call maneuver warfare, using mobility, flexibility, and surprise to overwhelm the enemy. Think about it. Modern armies try to keep their supply chains light with things like airborne resupply, drones, or self-sufficient small units. The Mongols were already doing their version of that 800 years ago. So what's the real legacy of this so-called endless march? It's that the Mongols managed to turn the hardships of nomadic life into advantages that reshaped warfare. Speed replaced sheer numbers. Discipline replaced reliance on massive supply trains, and improvisation replaced rigid planning. They created a system where culture, organization, and logistics came together to produce something that looked unstoppable. If you squint, you can almost see the outlines of modern warfare in their methods, and maybe that's why we still study them today. The Mongols weren't just conquerors of land, they were conquerors of time and distance. And that's a kind of victory that echoes far beyond the 13th century. Thanks for sticking with us all the way to the end. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our daily deep dives into epic battles and mind-blowing strategies. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like to let us know and drop a comment. We want to hear your thoughts. Share this video with a friend who loves history or someone who needs a reminder that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being curious. And we'll see you tomorrow with another story that will make you see the past in a whole new way.